Good evening, I'm Mehdi Hassan. I want to start tonight by taking you back to the early 1990s because there was a dictator in power, millions of civilians whose lives were in danger, great danger, and a US president who announced this.
The United States and its coalition partners have today informed the Iraqi government that 24 hours from now, coalition aircraft, including those of the United States, will begin flying surveillance missions in southern Iraq. The coalition is also informing Iraq's government that in order to facilitate these monitoring efforts, it is establishing a no-fly zone for all Iraqi fixed and rotary wing aircraft.
It was one of two quote-unquote no-fly zones proclaimed by the US after the 1991 Gulf War. The first was to protect Kurds in northern Iraq, and the second, the one you just saw being announced by George Bush Sr., was imposed to protect Shia communities in the south of the country, an area then called the Killing Zone. Here's how all that played out.
The Killing Zone covers the southern one-third of Iraq, giving air protection to more than 30,000 rebels. U.S. jets will take on Iraqi combat planes, which have been used against the rebels, as well as helicopters, which have been used to spot artillery targets.
We are not focusing on the ground operation this time.
Pentagon officials doubt if Saddam will risk his few remaining modern fighters. But he may send commercial airliners into the zone, daring U.S. airmen to kill civilians.
Before the White House announcement, I asked the Iraqi Minister of Information if Iraq would resist the U.S.-led flyovers.
When we are attacked, we will defend ourselves.
Defend meaning what?
Any air defense system will be used when the country is attacked.
It will be used against invading aircraft.
Of course.
Ultimately, the US-led coalition's bombings, while enforcing the no-fly zones, led to between hundreds and over 1,000 civilian casualties, according to various estimates. But when it came to the no-fly zones themselves, no Iraqi aircraft actually had to be shot down. That kind of military-to-military confrontation never happened. But that would change just 2 years later in Europe, in the Balkans. At the beginning of the brutal Bosnian civil war in October 1992, the UN Security Council passed a resolution imposing a no-fly zone over Bosnian airspace. And after months of bombardment by Serbian forces that repeatedly violated the no-fly zone, the UN passed Resolution 816, which authorized member states to take all necessary measures to ensure compliance. NATO had been watching and finally began Operation Deny Flight in April 1993. After nearly a year of Serbian fighter bombers violating the no-fly zone, NATO finally took action, the first ever combat mission in its history, on February 28, 1994. Have a listen to how that was carried out.
12:31 a.m. Eastern Time, a NATO AWACS early warning aircraft picks up the Bosnian Serb jets on its radar. They're about 5 miles southwest of Banja Luka over central Bosnia. The NATO plane alerts 2 U.S. F-16 Falcons on NATO patrol near Mostar, about 100 miles away. They race toward the targets, 6 Yugoslav-built Galeb light attack jets like these, subsonic, no match for the high-performance F-16s. 12:35 a.m., the NATO aircraft broadcasts a warning. Get out of the no-flight zone or get shot down. No response. 12:42 a.m., the F-16s broadcast the same warning. Again, no response. 12:43 a.m., the lead F-16 asks the AWACS for and gets NATO permission to fire.
Black 0, please. Clear to fire.
Clear to engage. But just before he can fire, the flight leader sees explosions on the ground. He tells controllers the Bosnian Serb pilots are bombing part of a Bosnian munitions factory. 12:45, the F-16 pilot fires his air-to-air missiles. 3 times in 3 minutes, he kills 3 of the Galeb jets.
In a coffee house tonight, Bosnian satisfaction was not so subdued.
I think it's good work.
Thanks, American people. Thanks, Mr. Clinton.
The Clinton administration actually faced criticism for not only stepping in so late, but for then being slow to enforce NATO's no-fly zone. And perhaps it was the lessons learned, if you will, that motivated the US under President Barack Obama to impose a sort of limited no-fly zone over Libya just a month into the Libyan civil war in 2011.
We will provide the unique capabilities that we can bring to bear to stop the violence against civilians. including enabling our European allies and Arab partners to effectively enforce a no-fly zone. I have no doubt that the men and women of our military are capable of carrying out this mission.
The no-fly zone was imposed especially to protect civilians in Benghazi, the rebel stronghold at the time fighting off the Libyan leader Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. As in Bosnia, the no-fly zone in Libya was backed by a UN Security Council resolution. But the operation in Libya quickly expanded beyond patrols of airspace and into regime change. U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta said it himself to reporters in June 2011. In Libya, quote, the objective is to do what we can to bring down the regime of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. That's also what the rebels had understood the mission to be, one local commander told CBS News at the time. Quote, when we get permission from NATO, we will advance forward. Well, we know how that ended up for the country and for the Libyan people. Libya is still a mess, sadly. And yet the mission creep we saw in Libya is important to keep in mind now, in 2022, when we're faced with the same growing debate over how to help protect Ukraine from the autocrat next door. Tomorrow morning, the Ukrainian president will address members of the United States Congress and will likely repeat his calls for a no-fly zone over his country. Here he is speaking earlier today.
Of course, Ukraine is not the NATO member. We understand that. We are quite adequate regarding our understanding. We have heard for many years about the open doors, but we also heard that we can't enter those doors. And this is truth, and we have simply to accept it as it is. And I'm glad that our people already have come to that understanding.
President Zelensky acknowledged that Ukraine does not have the protections of Article 5 of the NATO treaty, but he urged NATO countries to find other ways to help him and his government. One idea is a limited no-fly zone. 27 foreign policy experts wrote a letter to President Biden last week calling for such a no-fly zone over humanitarian evacuation corridors that Ukraine and Russia have agreed to. One of the signatories to that letter is the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, who I hope we'll speak to in just a moment. The calls have even starting to come from NATO members, too. Last night, Estonia's parliament adopted a resolution that, among other things, endorses a no-fly zone over Ukraine. It's become the first NATO member state to do so. But there is still strong opposition from senior officials, including from the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who explained last week why NATO is against a no-fly zone and why an aerial combat zone is perhaps a more accurate description for what needs to happen.
So a no-fly zone will require massive attacks on Russian air defense systems. And it will require that we are ready to engage directly in confrontation with Russian planes. This will significantly escalate the war, the fighting in Ukraine, but also, of course, risk a full-fledged war in Europe involving NATO allies.
We're faced with a serious question, no doubt, of how to help the Ukrainian people. And let's be clear, calls to offer protection in the sky will only grow as the Russians get closer to taking Kyiv, with all the death and destruction that will no doubt involve. But the West isn't up against Iraq's Saddam Hussein or Bosnia's Serbs or Libya's Gaddafi. The US wasn't imposing restrictions on a world power in any of those cases, let alone a nuclear-armed one. It's one thing to ask weaker countries to close the skies, but it's an entirely different thing to ask or expect Vladimir Putin to do the same and hope that he won't respond with force and possibly escalate to the use of nukes, God forbid. So where do we go from here? What do we do? Today, the UN announced more than 3 million refugees have now fled Ukraine, many with only their clothes on their back or a small suitcase. And as we've been saying, UNICEF estimates that half of those refugees are children. NBC's Gabe Gutierrez has the latest for us tonight from Ukraine.
Tonight, holding her 2 young daughters and nephew, Hanna Salenko is racing from her home in eastern Ukraine. Arriving in Lviv, her emotions caught up with her. I'm fleeing for the sake of my children, she tells us. UNICEF now says 1.5 million children have been forced to leave Ukraine. That's around 55 children every minute of the war, or almost one every second. Today, from the Netherlands to Belgium to France, where President Macron comforted refugees, more of Europe felt the strain of the growing crisis. In Italy, school children welcome displaced Ukrainian students, while in Poland, Warsaw's mayor says 300,000 refugees have fled to his city in just 2 weeks. He's calling on the UN and the European Union to come up with a better plan.
We cannot do it forever. We cannot improvise anymore. We just need help.
Today, as we traveled into Ukraine, we met Zoriana Prosenko at the Hungarian border, reuniting with friends and family. She'd left her home near Kyiv with her 2 young children weeks ago. I'm just numb, she tells us. We had no intention of being refugees. Like her, so many now don't know when or if they'll return. The uncertainty here is crushing.
I must save my family.
Konsta and his wife Elisa are frantically trying to reach Poland after their town in eastern Ukraine was bombed. Among their baby's first words, she's 10 months old and already knows war too well.
That was NBC News national correspondent Gabe Gutierrez reporting. Joining me now to talk about the no-fly zone debate, Ivo Dolder, who was U.S. ambassador to NATO under President Obama. He is now president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Ivo, thanks so much for coming back on the show. What do you make of calls for a limited no-fly zone, not a full zone where we have to take out Russian air defenses first, but where we simply, the argument is that we simply say over the evacuation corridors that have already been agreed between the Russians and the Ukrainians, NATO aircraft will patrol and make sure that those corridors stay safe. No one fires on anyone else. What's your response to that?
Well, I understand the moral inclination, the idea that because what is happening inside Ukraine, for us to do what we can to protect the Ukrainian people from the onslaught, from the brutality that the Russian military is inflicting on them, and the humanitarian instinct of providing as much assistance and as much help to the Ukrainians as possible is completely understandable. The problem with the proposal of a limited or humanitarian no-fly zone is that it crosses a particular line. It puts NATO aircraft directly into the battle space over Ukraine, and that's a line that NATO up to this point and President Biden up to this point has not been willing to do. Presumably, it means that at the very least we would have to attack any aircraft or any missile defense system manned by Russians that was threatening or attacking NATO aircraft. You can't just fly and then hope that nobody attacks you. You would have to be prepared to attack those forces. That's one problem. The second problem is that the vast majority of the damage that is being done on Ukrainians in these humanitarian corridors on the cities is not coming from aircraft or missiles launched from aircrafts. It's coming from ground-launched missiles, from rockets, from tanks, from artillery shells, and a no-fly zone wouldn't affect any of that. If you wanted to do something about that, you would have to strike those targets. And indeed, in Libya, that was the no-fly zone that was imposed. It wasn't just to prevent aircraft from flying, but to bomb forces on the ground. So then you'd be at war with Russia. That's the fundamental problem. You either have to choose to go to war to protect the Ukrainians, or to help the Ukrainians to protect themselves. So far, we've been right, I think, to be on that more restrained way of thinking about it.
Ivo Dolder, hold that thought. Joining us, I'm delighted to say, on the phone to talk about this is Bill Taylor, who was U.S. ambassador to Ukraine under President George W. Bush. He was later the top U.S. diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv after President Trump recalled the U.S. ambassador in 2019. You at home may remember him from President Trump's first impeachment hearings. Bill Taylor is now the vice president for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. We're glad to have him on the phone. We were having some technical issues earlier. Bill, I'm not sure if you heard what Ivo Dolder was saying. I'd like you to respond, but before you do, I know you signed that letter calling for a limited no-fly zone. Have a listen to Pentagon spokesman John Kirby on ABC News this past Sunday. Have a listen.
Could a no-fly zone could have stopped this?
No, I don't think so, Martha. Look, I mean, no-fly zone has a nice air policing kind of sound to it, but I participated in one as a young officer on an aircraft carrier way back in the early 90s. It is combat. You have to be willing to shoot and to be shot at.
Bill Taylor, what's your response to both John Kirby and what you heard from Ivo Dolder?
So, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the phone. I'm sorry there is a technical difficulty here, but I'm very glad to join Ambassador Dolder and you on this. And it's a great question. It is a great question. The issue of a no-fly zone, as Ivo has indicated, is a response, is an attempt to demonstrate a problem. And the problem is one that, again, Ivo has described, that is the bombardment from all kinds of sources, including aircraft, but he's absolutely right. Missiles, cruise missiles, artillery are also just wreaking havoc on the Ukrainians. And the question is how to respond to that. There are ways to do that. You know, our proposal is a narrow one, is a limited one, is where you have an agreement for humanitarian corridors agreed with the Russians and the Ukrainians that they would have some commitment to not fly their aircraft over that corridor, and we would also be very sure to use the deconfliction hotline that is set up and does work to be sure that the Russians know that this is a humanitarian corridor agreed. And so we would take those precautions. That said, it is risky. There is no doubt. And the idea is to call attention. If this is not going to work, and if the administration decides, you know, rightly or wrongly, they have good arguments not to do this, then there are other things that can and should be done. There are air defense weapons, both mobile and across the border, that some of the former Soviet Union, some of the Warsaw Pact nations now in NATO have, and there are some surface-to-air missiles, some air defense weapons that are mobile that can provide this cover for humanitarian corridors or
yes.
for a no-fly space. So this is an attempt to draw attention to that problem.
So, Ivo, you heard Bill Taylor there lay it out. Bill Taylor says it's a risky move. But are we overstating the risks of intervention, Ivo? Because in the Washington Post last week, Evelyn Farkas, who I know you know, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under Obama, she wrote there's no automatic escalation from one Russian aircraft downed by a NATO fighter to full-blown war. In admittedly very different circumstances, in 2015, NATO member Turkey shot down a Russian aircraft in Turkey's airspace. The Russian planes had been flying sorties over Syria, and there was no counterattack from Putin to that. Are we maybe over-exaggerating what Putin is willing to do and giving him a veto here?
We may be, but then we may not be. That's part of the problem. The problem is we just don't know. And up to this point, we have made the calculation, and that's political leaders throughout NATO, starting with President Biden, that there is a line that at the moment we're not willing to cross, which is to risk direct military confrontation between Russian and NATO forces. And I recall that this was a position that we had even before the war, because if you really wanted to prevent what was going on right now, we should have deployed large numbers of American and NATO troops to Ukraine before the war started. But no one was prepared to do that, but in part because Ukraine was not a NATO member, but frankly because no one at that point wanted to risk a war with Russia. And so as a result, we should reassess this day in and day out and make a calculation on what the risk and the benefit may be on each and every point. But let's not pretend that there's something that is not risky. It is risky. It is likely to lead to confrontation. Whether that confrontation then leads to escalation to full-out war, who knows? But if we're not prepared to go all the way, then we probably shouldn't take the first step either.
So, Bill, just coming back to your point, you've mentioned risk, Ivo's mentioned risk. I think we can all agree this is about the balance of risks and where we stand on that. Putin himself has said, quote, to any nation declaring a no-fly zone, that very second, we will view them as participants of the military conflict. I have to ask, therefore, how do you know that Putin will not use nuclear weapons against NATO countries in Europe, against the US, even in Ukraine in a tactical way? And I know you might say, well, we can't know, but if we can't know, then shouldn't the position be the position of caution, given the alternative is a nuclear holocaust?
We definitely don't want a nuclear holocaust. That's clear. We don't want a conflict with Russia. That's clear. What we do want is we do want to indicate that we are serious about providing support to the Ukrainians in ways that we have talked about and other ways as well. So the risk is there, and Abel's exactly right. You cannot address this risk without the knowledge of where this might go. So I acknowledge that, and this is an issue that we have to continue to think about. But there are areas there are weapon systems that we can provide to start to deal with this issue.
And Ivo, I just want to pick up on something you mentioned a moment ago. You said we should have sent troops to Ukraine beforehand if we wanted to go down that road. We didn't because they're not a NATO member. In theory, we understand the difference. Article 5 means if Poland is attacked by Putin, we will go to full-scale war with Russia. Ned Price, State Department spokesman, made that very clear recently, that that will be the response. It would be a full response. Some might say, though, in the real world, it's pretty arbitrary to say we want to avoid a nuclear war no matter the cost, unless the bombs drop 20 miles to the west, unless it goes across a certain border. Then we're fine to risk nuclear war. I mean, how do you respond to someone who says that makes no sense in the real world, that we're willing to risk a nuclear war for Poland but not for Ukraine simply because of a treaty obligation?
Well, the treaty obligation is trying to send a very strong message to Vladimir Putin. It's meant as much as a deterrent as it is about defending afterwards. And it says that there is this line, it's called the border, that distinguishes between a territory where we do not have a commitment to defend them. And in fact, I think the last 6 months has pretty much underscored that. But there are other parts on the territory where that line is the other side of the border, where in fact we are willing to defend them. And I think we've made this distinction in all of our conversations, and we need to continue to have that distinction. I think Bill's exactly right that there is more we can do to help the Ukrainians to defend themselves. The line gets crossed when we start directly participating in the defense of Ukraine. And it weakens at that point also the deterrent impact towards Russia to say, we're going to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, but if you attack a NATO member, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, whichever, we are actually going to defend that territory with consequences that are truly severe, even for Russia itself. And that's, I think, how we make that distinction.
Bill Taylor, we're almost out of time. Last word to you. President Zelensky will address Congress tomorrow morning. Is there anything he can say that you think will put a dent in the opinion of the United States government when it comes to no-fly zones, or even supplying MiGs from Poland directly to Ukraine, which is also seen as crossing a line vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin?
So President Zelensky is a very talented speaker, and he is very commanding. He's very charismatic. He can make his points extremely well, and he will make this point to the Congress, and he will generate the conversation. He will generate the discussion. You ask if it's going to be enough to change the administration's mind? Probably not. There are other things that he can do and that we can do in response, and I hope we will.
We'll have to leave it there. Former ambassadors Ivo Dolder and Bill Taylor, thank you so much for your analysis. Appreciate it. Next, a live report from Lviv, Ukraine, from NBC's Cal Perry on the ground there. Plus, a Fox News cameraman and a producer have been killed outside Kyiv in the same attack that injured one of the network's reporters. I'll have a conversation about all of the threats that journalists are facing on the ground in Ukraine as Russia ramps up its attacks there. We're back after this quick break. Don't go anywhere. It's been nearly 3 full weeks since Russia began its assault on Ukraine, and not only are Ukraine's soldiers and civilians at risk, but the lives of the journalists covering the conflict on the ground inside of Ukraine are in danger as well. We learned that again today after Fox News announced that 2 of its team members have died. Veteran cameraman Pierre Zhokhevsky was a long-time war zone photographer with the network. Fox says his vehicle came under direct fire yesterday outside Kyiv. Killed alongside him was producer Sasha Kushanova. She was serving as a Ukrainian consultant for Fox, helping crews navigate Kyiv. Sasha was only 24 years old. Fox News correspondent Ben Hall was also injured in that incident and remains hospitalized, according to the network. The news comes just 2 days after another journalist and filmmaker, Peabody Award-winning Brent Renaud, who was making a film for Time, was killed. His vehicle also was fired upon as he reported from Irpin, a suburb of Kyiv that has seen intense fighting recently. Kyiv itself is now under a 35-hour curfew after Russian strikes rained down on residential neighborhoods, one hitting this 15-story apartment building. Flames and smoke engulfed the building as firefighters tried to rescue those trapped inside. Kyiv's mayor says at least 4 people were killed in today's strikes. Bombs also hit a Kyiv metro station where residents were sheltering deep underground. NBC chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel filed this report from the station.
Russia is now expanding its attacks deeper into the heart of Kyiv. This is one of the city's main subway stations, and it was hit by a Russian strike at roughly 5 o'clock in the morning. People had been sheltering here. People have been using these subway stations as bomb shelters, staying mostly in the underground levels, deep below the streets. No one was killed or hurt in this attack because they were deep underground, but there is a lot of damage, and volunteers have been coming in from the entire neighborhood to help pick up all of the broken glass here. In one sense, this shows that Russia is expanding its attacks, hitting right into the center of Kyiv. You can't get a more downtown location than this one. But it is also a sign of weakness because Russia's front lines have not been advancing. Its troops and armored vehicles and that long convoy outside of Kyiv are where they are and have not been advancing for the last several days. Instead, Russia's relying more on its long-range weapons, its artillery and rockets to carry out attacks like this one that are generally untargeted, hit primarily civilians, and are part of a long Russian campaign of attrition.
That was NBC's Richard Engel. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky spoke to the Canadian House of Commons today, pleading for that nation to take further action.
You all need to do more to stop Russia, to protect Ukraine, and by doing that, to protect Europe from Russian threat. They're destroying everything, memorial complexes, schools, hospitals, housing complex. They already killed 97 Ukrainian children. We are not asking for much. We're asking for justice, for real support, which will help us to prevail.
Let's go to NBC's Cal Perry, who's on the ground in Lviv, Ukraine. Cal, we got the tragic news today that a Fox cameraman and a producer were killed while reporting outside Kyiv. It's a harsh reminder of how dangerous the job of a reporter in a war zone can be. How are people reacting to the news where you are in Lviv?
Well, and look, pull the curtain a little bit back for the viewers. Most journalists here in the city are staying in one of like 4 hotels. And on the ground here, when we're in zones like this, it's a collegial atmosphere. You know, we put all of the editorial stuff that may exist in the U.S. to the side, and we try to help each other out as best we can. Look, Pierre was a mainstay in these stories. I knew him from Iraq, going all the way back to 2003. He was in the business before that. He was instrumental in helping to get Fox News local staff out of Afghanistan. He's one of these people that you would see in these places, sort of fearless and an incredible journalist. His partner, Sasha, in this is, I think, really important to explain to our viewers. It's the local staff here that we rely on, that all networks rely on to get any of our things and the information done and properly out. They are the ones who are leading the charge on this. And to be clear, and I said this on the air earlier, and I want to be a little bit harsh about it, we leave. We come to these places, we cover these stories, and then we go home. And we'll come back and we'll visit, but these people live here, and it's their country, and they're able to work with us while their country falls apart around them. And it is truly heroic to see because she was 24 years old, Sasha, and the longer you do this, the more these kids remind us of our kids, right? And 24 years old, she was out there for her country, doing the job, trying to get the truth out, and died doing it. And so here in this hotel, it was a really sad day, and it'll be a sad few days as we try to remember these folks.
Truly sad indeed. And one quick question before I let you go. What do we know about what's happening in Kyiv, where there is a curfew in place and where apartment buildings have been attacked by the Russian military?
Yes, so 24 hours ago, your colleague Richard Engel was talking about one apartment building that was hit. Well, they hit 3 others. They hit a marketplace today. They hit that subway. So the shelling has widened as the ground offensive gets closer. All the while, you have this extraordinary moment of 3 heads of state getting on a train here in Lviv, going to the capital, announcing it ahead of time, saying we are going to go to a city that is being shelled. It is a show of solidarity amongst European leaders that we really haven't seen, I don't think, in a generation. Truly a remarkable moment. Again, we should remind our viewers, a city under curfew, a city that is being indiscriminately shelled, and the prime ministers of 3 nations choosing to take the train that the Russians know is running to the capital to show their support for the president.
That is truly remarkable. We will have to leave it there. Cal Perry, thank you. Please do stay safe, and we appreciate all the work you are doing for our networks on the ground. Thank you. The deaths of at least 3 journalists in the past few days in Ukraine highlight the dangers that journalists face doing their jobs in a conflict zone. The Committee to Protect Journalists says 9 journalists and media workers have been killed so far this year, including a Ukrainian camera operator killed when Russia struck a TV tower. That figure does not include the 2 deaths confirmed by Fox today. But it does represent a third of the number of journalists that CPJ says was killed last year, 27 across 2021. Organizations like CPJ and others that advocate for press safety warn that the situation in Ukraine is becoming more dire by the day for reporters on the ground. Reporters on the ground are considered civilians, and if they're intentionally targeted, not just by the Russian military, but by forces in armed conflicts all over the world, sadly, it can be considered a war crime. Joining me now is Summer Lopez, PEN America's Senior Director of Free Expression Programs. PEN America, of course, is an organization that champions open expression and free journalism worldwide. Thank you so much for appearing on the show this evening. How dire is the situation on the ground getting in Ukraine from what you know? Is there a fear that journalists are now being intentionally targeted?
Thank you for having me, Mehdi. I think that we're still learning about what exactly has happened to the journalists that we've seen killed in the last few days. We're not sure, I think yet as to whether or not they've been deliberately targeted. But, of course, I think we recognize that, we have to think about this a little bit in the context of Putin's broader assault on the media within Russia, his attempts to control information about the war. He's really obliterated independent media in Russia. He's made it impossible for people to talk honestly about it. I think he would gladly keep all of us in the dark if he could. And certainly we know the Russians are targeting civilian targets. And of course, as you said, journalists are considered civilians. And so it vastly increases the risks for them as well.
So how does Ukraine compare to previous conflicts when it comes to press safety? Because it's easy to say, look how awful the Russians are being, which they are, but even the United States has been accused of targeting journalists in conflict zones, like the infamous 2003 air raid that struck Al Jazeera offices in Baghdad, killing a reporter and injuring his cameraman at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, covering war is always extremely dangerous for journalists. Part of the issue, I think, here is the nature of this war and of other recent wars, like we've seen in Yemen, in Syria, where, of course, Russia was also involved, and in Iraq, where, combat is often happening in urban residential areas. There are multiple fronts. There's a combination of air bombardments, shelling, gunfire. All of this, again, increases the risks for journalists, makes it easier for militaries to say, that they thought a target was valid. I think it reiterates the importance, both the dangers that journalists face, but also the importance of them being on the ground, because they're the ones who can actually report on these incidents, who can document what's happening and lay the groundwork for future investigations and accountability.
So you mentioned the situation within Russia itself. We know Russia is cracking down on journalists reporting of the war back home. We saw the protester yesterday hold up a no war sign. What is it like to be a Russian journalist or protester, for that matter, right now?
It's extremely high risk. And I think, we're seeing a lot of Russian journalists who are leaving the country, who are really having to think seriously about whether they can continue to do their work at all anymore. And, the other area of risk here that I think doesn't get a lot of coverage is the fact that for Ukrainian journalists in the parts of Ukraine that Russia invaded in 2014 and where separatists have been in control in the Donbass and Crimea, the risks have been very high this whole time. We've been seeing Ukrainian journalists detained, held for years, We just saw a Ukrainian journalist disappeared over the weekend in Kherson, an area where there are now Russian military in control. And so I think, it's a threat in Russia. It's a threat because it's a war zone. But the more territory in Ukraine that Russia controls, the greater the risks for Ukrainian journalists as well.
Quick last question, Summer. Is there anything that can be done by government, civil society, international organizations to keep journalists safer?
I mean, there's certainly, many sort of best practices for journalist safety. I think speaking up about it is incredibly important. Governments need to be clear that the direct targeting of journalists will not be tolerated, that there will be investigations and accountability. I think there will be opportunities for that down the line if the evidence suggests they are being deliberately targeted. And again, we know that there have been, unjust, arbitrary detentions of journalists in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine in the past as well.
Summer Lopez from PEN America, thank you so much for your time tonight. Appreciate it. Coming up next, Congresswoman Susan Weil from the House Foreign Affairs Committee joins me to talk about what she expects and hopes to hear from Ukrainian President Zelensky during his virtual address to Congress tomorrow morning. And as we go to break, thoughts from the mayor of Kyiv following another night of apartment buildings being shelled, killing more Ukrainian civilians. He was asked to describe the spirit of the Ukrainian people today.
The spirit right now, everyone is angry. I talk to the people. They don't want to leave. In this activity, bring much more energy to everyone, and everyone understand. Don't want to leave, want to defend our city.
Вечірній Київ. Наш офіс. Понеділок, вечір. Ви знаєте, ми звикли говорити понеділок день важкий. В країні війна, тож кожен день понеділок.
That was Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky last week, showing the world that he's still in Kyiv, even as it is encircled by Russian troops. Zelensky's nightly addresses posted to social media have become appointment viewing for the Ukrainian people, drawing comparisons to FDR's fireside chats. And tomorrow, Zelensky will follow in the tradition of another wartime leader, Winston Churchill, who came to the US Capitol in 1941 to help build support for the Allied war effort. But these are unprecedented times, and when Zelensky addresses members of Congress at 9 a.m. in a Capitol Hill auditorium, he'll be speaking through a video feed from Kyiv. Before he was president, Zelensky was a comedian, an actor. And there's little doubt his personal charisma has fortified the Ukrainian resistance to Vladimir Putin and the Russian invasion, and inspired many in the West, too, far removed from the violence. Just today, he received a standing ovation from Canada's parliament. And last week, he became the first person to address Britain's parliament virtually in a rousing speech that many called, yes, Churchillian.
Because we don't want to lose what we've got, what is ours, our country. Just like you didn't want to lose your country when Nazi started fighting for your country, to be or not to be. You know this Shakespeare question. This question could be about Ukraine, but not anymore, because it is obvious that...
In his speeches, Zelensky has called for moral clarity about what Putin is doing to Ukraine, but also to his own people.
Тому що кожен постріл по Україні, кожен удар по Україні – це кроки до самознищення Росії, кроки до самоізоляції, до бідності.
But for all his stirring rhetoric and his leadership by example, Zelensky is still literally under siege and has so far failed to convince the West to confront Russian aggression more directly by supplying fighter jets or setting up a no-fly zone, as we discussed on the show earlier. There are a lot of risks surrounding that. Tomorrow's speech may be Zelensky's toughest yet, as he tries to move the needle with Congress in a room full of Democrats, many of whom don't want to escalate this conflict into World War III, and Republicans who are split over whether to confront Vladimir Putin at all, or to join their de facto party leader, former President Trump, in singing Putin's praises. So, what will be Zelensky's message to our elected officials tomorrow? And what more can they do to support him? Joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Susan Wild of Pennsylvania. She sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and will be attending that address by Vladimir Zelensky tomorrow. And she recently returned from a congressional trip to the Poland-Ukraine border. She's standing there outside the Capitol. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know it's a busy night for you. One almost gets tired of using the word unprecedented these days, but tomorrow you're going to be hearing live from the leader of a nation of 44 million people under fire in the largest European land war since World War II, a president who could be killed in that war any day. What are you hoping to hear from that president tomorrow?
Well, I listened to him address the Canadian Parliament this morning. I expect that it's going to be much the same message, and it's going to be a request for continued support, amplified support. I suspect he will again repeat his request for a no-fly zone and for transfer of those Russian warplanes, all of which I can fully understand. I also understand why we have not yet engaged in the no-fly zone aspect of that. I do want to point out that there has been a lot of support sent, and I believe that this administration has done a great job in pulling together our NATO allies and making sure that we're all on the same page. But a decision to escalate by enforcing a no-fly zone is something that can't be made just by the United States. And the Biden administration has not shown any indication that it's willing to go there, nor have our allies. So all I can say is I want us to be on the right side of history on this issue. I want to make sure we are doing absolutely everything that we can and that we are standing by ready to appropriate more as necessary to help the Ukrainian people.
So just picking on what you were saying there, just picking up on that, President Zelensky is expected to ask again for more war material and for a NATO no-fly zone over Ukraine. Today, Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell was asked about that repeated request from the Ukrainian president for a no-fly zone. Have a listen.
He already knows that the U.S. is not going to engage directly in Ukraine. We are not going to enforce a no-fly zone in Ukraine.
A growing number of Republican senators are starting to publicly disagree with Mitch McConnell. I just wonder, is there anything that Vladimir Zelensky could do tomorrow to convince you on a no-fly zone? And if not a no-fly zone, where is your line? Because personally, I totally understand why we wouldn't want to set up a no-fly zone. There is a very real risk of World War III and nuclear weapons being used. But where do we draw the line? Is it fighter jets? Is it fighter jets via Poland? Is it just anti-aircraft, small arms, etc.? Where do we draw the line?
I don't think that we can state an absolute on that, Mehdi. The circumstances change day by day. If chemical warfare is entered into, that will change the situation considerably. I do think that we have to be prepared to respond on an hour-by-hour basis, and I'm pretty well confident that we are. I think we have to have troops ready to go if there is a further escalation. But I wouldn't stop at anything short of a no-fly zone. I do believe those Russian war jets should be transferred, if for no other reason. I know I've heard the comments that they wouldn't do that much, it wouldn't be that helpful, but I honestly don't see the downside of doing that. Putin has said that would be an escalation, but he considers everything to be an escalation, including providing humanitarian aid. And at this point, if President Zelensky wants those warplanes, I think we need to be facilitating transfer of those warplanes. Now, having said that, I'm not the military expert. I do believe that our Department of Defense, that the Pentagon and our intel is extremely good on this. And so I certainly would not disagree with their position on the no-fly zone. I'm not convinced on this transfer of the war jets. And part of that, I have to tell you, having gone to Poland last weekend with 8 members total, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, we all left Poland believing that those Russian warplanes were in the process of or very close to being transferred. We were quite surprised when we were all in agreement that they should be. And then we were quite surprised when there was a change of heart by both the Polish, who wanted to send them first to a German, to an U.S. Air Force base in Germany, and then a change of heart by the DOD. So I don't know what the rationale is on that, and I'm not convinced that shouldn't be done. But I think every other form of support, munitions, ammunition, small hardware, humanitarian aid, absolutely needs to be sent. And, you know, this is a worldwide problem. This is not just about Ukraine.
Yes. And you mentioned you're not the military expert. We talk about how we define escalation. Let's talk about de-escalation. The famous Chinese strategist said, Sun Tzu said, give your opponent a golden bridge across which he can retreat. Is there a way of giving Vladimir Putin a face-saving way of getting out of Ukraine, even if he wants to declare victory to his people and just get out? Is there a way of ending this war and finding some diplomatic solution?
This is the question of the hour, and it's the question of every hour. We have been in many classified briefings. I have not yet heard anything that sounds like encouraging words that there's an exit ramp for Putin. And that concerns all of us tremendously, of course. I honestly believe that the quickest solution may be some sort of uprising by the Russian people or by Putin's closest circle. But we have to make sure we're doing everything to keep Ukraine strong, because that's the only way that Putin will ever retreat, or that his closest circle will insist that he retreat. But you know, I don't think you can engage in diplomatic discussions with somebody who is proven to be a liar, who goes back on his word, who says that we have a ceasefire over humanitarian missions and then proceeds to bomb civilians. How do you enter into diplomatic relations? Require some degree of trust, and there is no degree of trust between us, the NATO allies, and Putin.
Congresswoman, you mentioned earlier that you returned from a congressional delegation to the Polish-Ukrainian border. What did you see there in terms of the humanitarian situation? Is Poland being overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of refugees coming across the border? It's now a total of over 3 million Ukrainians have fled their country.
I did not have the impression that they were being overwhelmed when we left, but when we left, they were at 1.5 million refugees, and that has more than doubled at this point. I am hearing reports from people on the ground. I have constituents who have relatives in Warsaw and Krakow who are telling me that the country can't sustain much more of this. Every European country and the United States needs to step up to the plate, and Canada as well, and be prepared to accept refugees. I have been calling upon the Foreign Relations Committee and the administration to make sure that we are working on that, and that there will be a quick resolution of this in terms of the United States. We are working right now actively. My office is on getting 600 orphans out of Ukraine into the United States. I think we're going to succeed in that. These are children who were even before the invasion. But I also have constituents with family members who are there, who are deeply, deeply concerned, who are ready to offer them a home, jobs, support. And yes, the picture you're showing right now is at the border. It was 125,000 refugees streamed across the border that day that we were there. We saw people that were just absolutely devastated and exhausted. And that was, that was a week ago, more than a week ago at this point. And so the situation has only grown worse. By the way, that is one of my constituents that you saw right over my head in that last picture, one of the troops, one of the soldiers there. And so I just want to make sure that we are doing our part and that every NATO ally is doing its part. We cannot leave this all up to Poland. They've been doing a commendable job. Don't get me wrong. The Polish people, the Polish government have been absolutely spectacular. But we've got to make sure that we are prepared to do our part, too.
Yes, we do. And let's see what the president says tomorrow to Congress. It'll be interesting for you to be there watching. You'll be sitting in a room full of members of Congress, some of whom have spread some pretty crazy conspiracy theories about Ukrainian biolabs, and others who, of course, refused to vote to impeach or convict President Trump when he was extorting the guy who will be speaking to you live via video link. Congresswoman Susan Weil, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking time out. I know you're busy this evening, so we appreciate it. We have an update on the protester who made an anti-war display on Russian state TV in Moscow on Monday night. We now know Marina Ovsyannikova was an employee at the TV network. Following her demonstration, a human rights group posted this video where she explained her motivation. She says, quote, "Responsibility for this crime lies only on the conscience of one person. That person is Vladimir Putin." She appeared in court today in Moscow for conducting an unauthorized protest and was fined 30,000 rubles, about $280. She spoke to reporters after the hearing.
It was my own anti-war decision. Yeah, I made this decision by myself because I don't like Russia start this invasion, and it was really terrible.
A more serious criminal proceeding is likely to come next. Because of the on-air aspect of her protest, it's possible she could face up to 15 years in prison, ridiculously, for spreading fake news about Russia's war against Ukraine under a new and authoritarian law passed during this invasion. The United Nations Human Rights Office is asking Russian authorities to, quote, not punish her for exercising her right to freedom of expression. Something I'm sure Vladimir Putin will pay a great deal of attention to. Next, I dive into the relationship between Donald J. Trump and Vladimir Putin. Trump used to praise him, of course, but now he's saying he was tough on him. Last night, least favorite son Eric Trump told Sean Hannity on Fox he thinks he knows why Putin didn't invade while his father was president.
I had your dad on this program Thursday of last week. He was very clear this would never happen if he was president. Why?
Well, listen, Putin was in with the KGB. He can read people, and he could tell that Donald Trump was a very strong person, right?
Yes, you heard that correctly. Eric Trump says Putin could read people, and that Donald J. Trump, to him, was a very strong person. Stop laughing and stay with me, as we'll be back after a very short break with the facts on the Trump-Putin bromance. You do not want to miss this.
Imagine that a night before a game, you must lie awake thinking, I'm not good enough, everybody's better than me, I'm not going to score any points, I have no business playing this game.
Well, not really.
Michael, denial ain't just a river in Egypt.
That was a pre-senatorial Al Franken as his iconic Saturday Night Live character Stuart Smalley interviewing basketball legend Michael Jordan. But 3 decades later, we all know who the true king of denial is: Donald J. Trump. The former guy denied mocking a disabled reporter during the 2016 campaign, even though we all saw him do it on tape. Donald Trump denied knowing who the Proud Boys are, but in the 2020 presidential debate live on TV, he asked them to stand back and stand by. Just recently, Trump denied flushing his White House documents down the toilet. The water pressure is so weak, he complained at a 2020 campaign rally. People, quote, people have to flush their toilet 15 times. But is there any denial of his that's more ridiculous than when he claims that he was not soft on Vladimir Putin? A line of argument that the right has been pushing for weeks now, ever since Russia's war with Ukraine began. They say Donald was always tough on Vlad. They're wrong. They're gaslighting you, and we have the receipts to prove it. Play the tape.
Nobody was ever tougher on Russia than me. I'm the one that stopped the pipeline. I had it stopped. I'm the one that put all the sanctions on. My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this, I don't see any reason why it would be. As everyone understands, this horrific disaster would never have happened if our election was not rigged and if I was the president.
You know, I was in Moscow a couple of months ago. I owned the Miss Universe pageant, and they treated me so great. Putin even sent me a present, beautiful present with a beautiful note.
I stopped his pipeline. I sanctioned them more than anybody ever sanctioned them.
Putin called me a genius. Putin said Donald Trump is a genius.
Nobody was ever tougher on Russia.
But if the United States got along with Russia, wouldn't be so bad.
This would not have happened during my administration.
Putin's a killer. A lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
In fact, some people were saying, why didn't this take place over the last 4 years during our administration? And it didn't, for a very good reason, and I'll explain that to you someday.
I don't think Putin has any respect whatsoever for Clinton. I think he does respect me, and I hope I get along great with him.
That does it for me tonight. Make sure to join us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook. More on the very latest on the situation in Ukraine tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern, live right here on The Choice from MSNBC. For now, from me, Good night. Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of The Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.